Hello everyone, sorry I'm a bit late. I had a problem setting up the streaming server, but I'm here now, if you managed to wait this long. But never mind, it's going to get recorded anyway. So, where do we start? Well, the reason why I'm doing this live stream is because I had a quick look at an old recording of an old live stream I did, which gave some information about Dr. Shen's lineage, or some of his lineage, some of which was slightly wrong. I just thought something or been told something and it turned out that it wasn't quite correct. So rather than pointing out the things that were wrong, I just thought I'd do another one, which is based off some recent research I've been doing. In fact, I might do a few of these if I manage to make it work okay next time. So it's based on some research I've been doing, and I just want to pick out one particular group of characters that I think are quite interesting, and perhaps talk about them over several live streams. So let's just have a look at the characters involved today, shall we? First of all, we have Dr. Shen, who for some reason had some red lines around him. This is what happens when you try to run a one-man show. You get all these technical difficulties. And so the line I want to look at today basically goes to, there we go, there's some more red lines for you, goes to Professor Yao Huanxi, who was Dr. Shen's Tai Chi Chuan, his main Tai Chi Chuan teacher, not his only teacher, but his main one. So there's two kind of key people, really. I mean, in fact, really one, actually, but let's just say two for the sake of argument, that were connected with him that I want to talk about today. But one of them I don't want to talk about today, and that person is this guy, who was his Tai Chi teacher, his main Tai Chi teacher. He had quite a few of them. His name is Dong Yingjie. Don't quote me on that, on the pronunciation. He was an important student, actually, Tai Chi Chuan student of Yang Chengfu. Sorry, I don't have a photograph of him to put up, but hopefully you all know who he is and what he looks like, and if you don't, it's quite easy to find it online. So Yang Chengfu was the main sort of populist, if you like. He popularized Tai Chi Chuan, certainly within China, and particularly the Yang style. So he's pretty famous, but this guy is also quite famous because he was from a generation of martial artists, and they felt that it was important to demonstrate that their art was effective. And so he is famous for having gone in the ring with a number of martial artists from different styles, including a couple of Western boxers, and beaten them using Tai Chi Chuan. So it's a shame these things weren't captured on video so that people can go, oh, okay, Tai Chi Chuan isn't just floating around the room, it is actually a martial art, and can be used practically. So this is an interesting guy, but we're not going to be talking about him today. We might talk about him on another day. Instead, today, more red lines, sorry about that. I want to talk about this lady who was known to Professor Yao's students as Wang Tai Shimu, which literally translates to something like female master or lady master. So it's kind of like very similar to Shifu. I mean, this is Shimu. But her Wang was her married name, so I think that's why the Tai comes in there. So it's Wang. If it was Mrs. Wang, it would be Wang Tai Tai. But actually, they're saying she is Mrs. Wang, but she's actually a master. She was a Buddhist master, and Professor Yao took her to be his root master in Buddhism. So that's Wang Taishimu. Her maiden name was Chen Guanhuang, but nobody knew her as that because it was considered to be impolite to call her by that name. So it was Wang Taishimu. The best translation, actually, I think, into English of Wang Taishimu is Madame Wang. So you think of someone like maybe Madame Blavatsky. She's kind of like similar, only somewhat more better, shall we say. So that is Wang Taishimu, and then her Buddhist master was this guy. More red lines, sorry about that. His name was Norlha Hutuktu, Norlha Hutuktu, or Norlha Rinpoche, actually. But in China, they knew him as, in fact, they pronounced his name as Nuona. So it's usually transliterated as Nuona. And the Hutuktu is a Chinese, they don't use it anymore, but it's a Chinese title, effectively, because he was made at some point in charge of Tibetan and Mongolian affairs, and so the person who is given that honour is titled Hutuktu. So he was a Vajrayana Buddhist master, but he was also, in fact, just a lot like Dr Shen, you know, just an ordinary guy. And so normally people would see him more like this, just an ordinary gentleman, obviously quite impoverished looking, but he was Wang Taishimu's Buddhist master, and I just wanted to tell you the story of this guy, actually, and how he came to meet Wang Taishimu. So he was born in the late 1800s, and he lived in the region of Kham, which these days is kind of like contested as Tibetan or Chinese, but it's actually now considered to be part of Sichuan. But hopefully most of you have heard of the Kham region. And he was quite a character, because he wasn't just a Buddhist master, but he was also a very clever man. He was very politically minded, and also a military general of sorts, interestingly. And in around about the times between 1912 and 1918, he became involved with the fighting between the Tibetans and the British together against the Kham forces, and he was obviously siding with the Kham forces, who were being supported, incidentally, by the Chinese to a certain extent. So that was a bit of a surprise to me when I first discovered that, because I didn't realise that the British Empire was meddling in Tibetan affairs as well as other areas at that time. And around about so at some point in 1918, he got captured by the Tibetan army and taken to Lhasa, where he was interrogated by various people, including the 13th Dalai Lama, who was really trying to convince him to come over onto their side, because he had a lot of people behind him. He had a lot of support, and if he'd switched sides to the Tibetans, things would have gone a lot better for them. Things went okay for them in the end anyway. They came out on top on that fighting. The Kham forces didn't, obviously. But he would not, he refused to switch allegiance. And as a result of that, they imprisoned him. They imprisoned him in a dungeon. Let's go back to me. They imprisoned him in a dungeon that was 5 foot, apparently 5 foot by 6 foot square, and about 4 foot deep, they say. I think it must have been a bit deeper than that. And they covered it in planks. And he was fed 1 meal a day of basically plain bread and water of some kind. And they considered him to be quite a problem because he was resisting swapping sides. So there was still this resistance with the Kham forces as well because he hadn't changed allegiance. They kept him in prison, ultimately, for 6 years, although some of that time wasn't actually prison, it was a tomb. But to begin with, he was kept in prison, he was fed bread and water, and they attempted to poison him, apparently 3 times, with a poison which is supposed to actually be very effective. He didn't die from the poisoning, he was obviously poisoned, but he didn't die, he kept recovering. But on the 3rd attempt, he pretended to be dead. And the way in which he did this was by going into a deep form of meditation where it appears, let's say, that you're not breathing and your heart slows right down. It's kind of a bit like going into hibernation. Not many people can do this, but it can be done. And so the guards believed that he was dead. The British got involved with that and had a look too, and agreed that he was dead, but said that they probably ought to do an autopsy to make sure. One of the sides, I can't remember if it was the British or the Tibetans, but one of them decided that this was a really bad idea and that they should just wrap him up in a muslin cloth and entomb him. So they did that, but he wasn't dead. And he then spent some time using very clawy fingernails and a special Qigong technique of just turning your fingers into claws to dig his way out of this tomb. And it's recorded that he actually managed to get out on the 23rd. I'm just looking at my piece of paper here. The 13th of September 1923. So they say 6 years, but it looks like it's more like 5.5 years that he was actually kept prisoner. He, from escaping, he then snuck through, during that time, through very harsh Tibetan terrain and survived mainly by begging. As a part of that process, as a part of doing that, he bumped into, as if by magic, 2 lamas who recognized him and supported him, and they helped him. So they carried on traveling with him through India until he came to the coast to get him onto a boat, and from there he traveled by boat to Shanghai. And so eventually, in early 1924, he popped up in Beijing, very bedraggled, quite ill. But actually, interestingly, along the way, whilst he was traveling through India, he was healing people, which is kind of what he did, really. Apart from the politics and the military stuff, he was just being, your average Buddhist master, providing healing to various people. And so within India, I think he became a little bit well known about this traveling man who's coming around healing people, but trying to make his way to China ultimately. Anyway, he arrived in Beijing in 1924. And was looking very bedraggled. So when he was telling people who he was, no one believed him. He just looked like a beggar. He just looked like this, only a lot more bedraggled than that. So, but eventually somebody recognized him, and so then he was invited eventually, or in fact appointed onto the Mongolian and Tibetan Affairs Office in Beijing, probably Nanjing actually, and did sort of diplomatic work in that office for a couple of years. But at the same time, he started to do teaching and started to do Buddhist ceremonies and that kind of stuff. Eventually, in 1926, he moved to Chongqing in Sichuan and started teaching properly. So he kind of put aside the Mongolian and Tibetan affairs stuff for a bit and was teaching Vajrayana Buddhism and gained quite a following, and actually became quite famous. So his his existence there and his teaching was spread far and wide throughout China, and people were travelling there to see him and to receive empowerments from him. Lots of stuff happened, which I don't want to talk about because it would get boring. But we get to about spring 1933, and there's lots of bad stuff going on in China. Japan invaded Manchuria, and they're starting to cause problems in certain areas of China. And a lot of people actually say that the Second World War really started in the early 30s, when Japan were causing problems for China. But anyway, that's an aside. But because of those problems, Norlha was invited to Shanghai to do some ceremonies there to try to ward off calamities and such like. And this is where he met Wang Liping. Wang Liping is Wang Taishimu's husband, hence her name Wang. So he's Wang Liping is quite well known, but I don't have any photographs of him, unfortunately. And I'm struggling to find an awful lot of detail about him, other than in Western texts. Now, in Western texts, they've transliterated his name incorrectly to Wang Licheng. Wang Licheng. So if you see somebody in some book somewhere involved with Norlha whose name is Wang Licheng, it's actually Wang Liping, this man. And he was a relatively well-known scholar in Tibetan and Indian Buddhism in China. And so as a result of that meeting with Norlha appointed him to be a translator, to translate various Buddhist texts into Chinese, and also to accompany him on some trips to translate. Actually, Wang Liping met Norlha during an empowerment ceremony, and his wife was with him, but also Professor Yao. So the three of them together received empowerments from Norlha in 1933 in Shanghai. Unfortunately, Professor Yao, being a professor, was busy teaching, and that was it for him. That's all he could really do with Norlha. But the Wang family stuck around with Norlha for 3 years, and they studied Vajrayana with him for all of that time. 1936, so the end of that 3-year period where the Wangs were studying with him, Norlha decided to go back to Kham because there was some stuff going on there, some political stuff at a low level between a few tribes, I believe, or clans, I think they were called. And he kind of decided that he ought to go back there and try and sort that problem out. But actually, it just got worse and worse. So once he got there, things got worse and worse. And eventually, he was caught up in some fighting and was killed properly that time. So that was the end of Norlha. He died in 1936, which incidentally is a bit of a significant year because Yang Chengfu also died in that year. And so I think the Wangs just went back to Shanghai for a bit and were living with Professor Yao. So let's just scroll back through the photographs. So that's Wang Taishimu, that's Wang Liping's wife, Cheng Guanghuan. She's a very significant figure, and at some point I'd like to talk a little bit more about her. For now, it's worth just saying that she was a very gifted woman before even meeting Norlha Hutuktu. And in fact, the moment that Norlha placed his hand on her head during the empowerment, his hand apparently got stuck on there. And people thought this was an auspicious thing. And her husband, Wang Liping, just reached out and lifted Norlha's hand off her head and said something to sort of settle things down, settle matters down. A lot of people, well, not a lot of people, but some people who were close to the Wangs say that actually his hand didn't get stuck. It's just that he was he could see that she was a very gifted being, and was probably receiving empowerment from her through his hand. And so he kind of just sort of went into a bit of a trance and just paused for a bit. Who knows? But an interesting happening. And so, yeah, well, we can talk more about her another day, I think. Perhaps when I manage to get all of my technical stuff sorted out and get a few more pictures, because I've got one more photograph of her, but I just don't have it to hand at the moment. So we won't go to him. And this is Professor Yao. So basically what happened was Professor Yao received the empowerment at the same time as the Wangs from Norlha Hutuktu when he was in Shanghai in 1933. But because he was unable to study with Norlha, and because Wang Taishimu was a very gifted individual, he took her to be his Tibetan root master. So he still had the lineage to Norlha, but it was through Wang Taishimu. And then, of course, Dr Shen was learning Tai Chi Chuan from Professor Yao. When you're when there's other stuff going on, you know, when you're a whole person, the Buddhist studies and other things also come through and have an influence. And I'm saying other things because I don't want to say, yes, Professor Yao was just a Buddhist and Tai Chi Chuan teacher. He wasn't just that. He was much more than that. And again, at some point in the future, I can talk more about that. But at the very least, I would say that he was, Professor Yao was a very intelligent man. He taught English, actually, to begin with. He spent some time teaching English at a university before moving to Shanghai. And in Shanghai, well, it's debated, actually, but my feeling is that he mainly taught Chinese to foreign students at a university which was for foreign students mainly. So yeah, he was very gifted. That was his kind of like main profession. But then behind all of that, he was very interested in a lot of Chinese classical culture. He was interested in calligraphy, poetry, and various philosophies, including yin-yang philosophy, Confucianism, Taoist philosophy, and also, of course, Buddhist philosophy. And all of these things are sort of like in a big melting pot, which made him the character he was, and made him the person he was, the teacher he was to Dr. Shen. So there we are. There we have it. A quick tour of Norlha Hutuktu, who I think is a very interesting character, particularly how he escaped the Tibetans and the British. I hope you find that interesting. My feeling is that we could probably do a little bit better than this, because I think it'd be quite nice to have a sort of chart with those little pictures on, so you can see how people are kind of connected together. You can probably get a little bit lost just seeing one picture and then another picture and somebody chatting over it. So maybe I might try and do something like that with the next live stream. And perhaps I'm probably going to focus in on Wang Taishimu next and give some stories about her. But let's see how we get on, because I still got a bit more research to do with her. I think I'm going to leave it there now. Thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you found all of that interesting. And I look forward to seeing you all soon. Bye for now.